few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not al-Qaeda, you said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back.
The most recent and troubling of these has been Russia. Russia has used cyber attacks. Vladimir Putin, but Putin is playing a really tough, long game here, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, or anybody else. The United States has much greater capacity. We will defend the citizens of this country, and the Russians need to understand that. Invited Putin to hack into Americans. I spent a year and a half putting together a coalition that included Russia and
the Cold War's been over for 20 years.
Think of that picture we all saw of that 4-year-old boy with the blood on his forehead because he'd been bombed by the Russian and Syrian air forces. The Kremlin, meaning Putin and the Russian government, are directing the attacks. There are children suffering in this catastrophic war, largely, I believe, because of Russian aggression. The Russians hack information. We don't even know if it's accurate information. Maybe because he has praised Putin. Maybe because he says he agrees with a lot of what Putin wants to do. Maybe because he wants to do business in Moscow.
We're going to get to that later.
That he has
Secretary
with Russians.
Clinton.
Every day that goes by, we see the results of the regime by Assad in partnership with the Iranians on the ground, the Russians in the air. There is a determined effort by the Russian Air Force to destroy Aleppo. Russia hasn't paid any attention to ISIS. We need some leverage with the Russians because they're not going to come to the negotiating table. What is at stake here is the ambitions and the aggressiveness of Russia. Russia has decided that it's all in. I've stood up to Russia. I've taken on Putin and others, and I would do that as president. War crimes committed by the Syrians and the Russians.
When it comes to our foreign policy, you seem to want to import the foreign policies of the 1980s.
The Russian government has engaged in espionage against Americans. This has come from the highest levels of the Russian government, clearly from Putin himself. That the Russians are doing this. The help of Putin, Russian espionage. Russians have engaged in cyber attacks against the United States of America. Spout the Putin line. These cyber attacks come from the highest levels of the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin war aided and abetted by the Iranians and the Russians to frankly gain some leverage on both the Syrian government and the Russians. And it would also take making it clear to the Russians that we could strike a deal and make it very clear to the Russians.
In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back.
How did we get onto Putin?